Hello, everybody. Welcome to our video for week 2. Today, we are going to be talking about our PICO question, and we're going to delve into how to write that PICO question and how to consider the population that you want to look at, the variables that you want to look at, and how to make sure that our focus is not too broad and not too narrow. Before we get to that, the chapter we read this week was the ethics chapter. A lot of these things, I think, are things that you're aware of from taking just our counseling ethics classes. I know that there's 2 different classes that you've already been through, and I know you've talked about ethics in all of your classes. But what I think is interesting from this chapter and what we need to keep in mind is that sometimes we don't consider the fact that research is actually an ethical obligation that we have. And when I say that, I don't mean in the sense of publishing. I know that, as a professor, if that's something that you want to do, if you want to get into that side of counseling, yes, then publishing becomes part of that. But what I'm really talking about is just being able to read research and to be sure that we are using interventions that are research based. So that is part of our ethical obligation. It is in our ACA Code of Ethics. So I think recognizing that is very important. The other thing I want you to be aware of from the chapter is those 9 core ethics that are discussed. Again, I think they're pretty obvious, but we need to remember that those apply to ethics as well as our counseling interventions. Also, the chapter talks about peer review. We've been hearing about peer review in undergrad. You talked about peer review, and we definitely talk about peer review in grad, in our master's program. We need to know why. Why is it important that it's peer reviewed? Again, it's trusting that the people that you are working with, your peers, other counselors, are going to be able to give you a better sense of what's important in your interventions, and recognizing that is important, because if it's not a peer, they may not be looking at it in the same way we would look at it as counselors. I find this a lot of times in the job that I have, because I'm working within a school district. Sometimes there's a lack of recognition of how counseling works and how counseling techniques work and how ethics work, all of those things, because the people that I'm working with in the school district, they're not required to know that information. Our peers know that information. So again, recognizing the importance of peer review is something that I think is important from this chapter. I also just thought it was interesting when in the reading, the discussion about how some counselors, the things that counselors don't do that we would just assume they do. One statistic that really stood out to me was the 7% that would not obtain parental consent to do research. That kind of blows my mind. With all of our training, I can't imagine why someone would do anything with a young adult or anyone under 18, a minor, and not get parental consent. And yet 7% of our peers didn't think they needed to do that. So those things that sometimes we take for granted, we just need to make sure that we're really aware of those. The other thing is consultation. I've taught the ethics classes, and one of the things I always say is consult, consult, consult. So it's the same with research ethics. If you ever feel like maybe you're not sure, or is this really an okay situation, talk to someone. That's the best thing you can do. So remember, consult, consult, consult. And then the last thing that came from the chapter specifically that I wanted to mention was just being aware of multicultural issues with research. We don't want to over generalize our research. And so that means that we need to be sure that we include special populations, and that we have a multicultural balance when we do our research. So something to always think about are those multicultural issues. But again, this applies to research as well. So those are some things just from chapter 2 that I wanted to mention. But really what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about our PICO question. And within your I'm getting my screen up. Within your Blackboard, there is under the under the lecture tab, there is a PowerPoint that we're going to look at together. Let me get that going. Specifically talking about how to write a good research question. And I need to give credit, so I want to thank Dr. Lenz for sharing this information with us. So, when we talked about this last week, when we think about research, what do we think of? So, some of us get kind of sweaty and think, oh, research. But as we talked about, it's not a scary thing. It's part of our job. It's part of what we do. And looking at the way that counseling is evolving now, and especially with managed care, we need to think of research as a piece of our counseling profession, because that's really what it is. But from our previous experience, that may not always be the way we think about it. We may think about it as a separate issue. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about just research questions in general and the scientific method. We're going to talk about two different strategies for creating quantitative research questions and how to apply those as well. So first, when we're talking about the scientific method, and this is something that we're all familiar with, but remember that the scientific method, just as when we write our research question, is an ongoing process. It's not usually a one and done kind of situation. So we remember the scientific process. We make an observation. So I'm just going to give an example of something. In my job, I work specifically with adolescents. So what's something that I have observed in working with adolescents? Well, one thing that I have observed is that there seems to be a correlation between media use and mental health diagnoses. That's something that I have observed. So now I'm going to look at that as a question. Is that a correlation? Is there any validity to that? What would the question be if I wanted to ask that question? Maybe I would just ask, is there a correlation between mental health diagnoses and media use? There's my question. Now I'm going to get to a hypothesis. Well, obviously, because I've made this observation, my hypothesis, would be, yes, there's a correlation there. Something I want to say about that. Sometimes it's difficult for us with research to understand that it's okay if our hypothesis is wrong. The idea of research is not to make us right. The idea of research is to figure out if our hypothesis is correct. And if it isn't, that allows us to go back and consider, what does that mean? What does that mean for the interventions that I'm proposing? So now I'm going to develop a testable prediction. How would I test that? So possibly I would do some sort of survey, time spent on media, and looking at mental health diagnoses based on the time spent on media. I'm going to have to define that further, right? I'm going to have to define the age group I'm working with specifically. I'm going to have to define, what is media? Does that include everything? Is that only social media? What does that mean? Does that include watching Netflix? I need to define that, because media is a really big term. So that's part of me narrowing or broadening my focus depending on what I need to do. I'm going to get my information. I'm going to gather all that data. And then from there, I'm going to end up with a general theory, either proving or disproving my hypothesis. So that's the scientific method. So where does a research question fit in? Well, the research question goes right here. It's where we start to develop the question in order to refute or support our hypothesis. So what we want to remember, and when we talked about this a few minutes ago when we were discussing ethics and we were discussing multicultural issues, we want to make sure that we're identifying our own points of bias. So in my question, I think you could probably tell from the way that I pose the question that I have an issue with the amount of media that is used by adolescents. My personal opinion, they use it too much. I can't let that bias seep into my question or seep into my data collection, because if it does, my research question is out the window. So I want to make sure that I'm very clear in the way I ask the question, and I want to make sure that I'm very precise in the methods that I use to collect the data. So that's just one example of how a research question fits in with the scientific method. So here's some things that we don't want to do. First of all, we don't want to just not ask the question. We can't, like I said, this is an ethical obligation. We can't just keep moving forward, recognizing that there's something there, but not researching, not looking into that further. So we want to make sure we ask the question. The other thing is as we move forward, you're going to see our question guides everything else that we do. We don't want to start with the method and then ask the question to match the method. We want to make sure that the question is the guiding force as we move into our research question. Again, what I was just talking about, we want to be sure that we're not giving ourselves the answer that we want to hear. We need to be sure that the methodological choices that we make, that's a hard word to say, that those go along with the research question that we've posed and are purposeful for that question, but we're not just deciding, okay, I'm going to do a quantitative study because I like that better, or I'm going to use qualitative because I think that's an easier research method. You need to make sure that the question is the guide. So some things that we want to be aware of when we start to ask our question: the population that we are going to be looking at with our research question. And we need to be somewhat specific about that. Again, it's the Goldilocks problem, right? We don't want it to be too broad, but we don't want it to be too narrow. We've got to find that spot that's just right. And so that's what we're going to be doing in going back and forth talking about your research questions. The intervention that we're going to apply, the variable, which would be the variable that we're going to apply. What variable or what outcome are we going to be looking at? What assessment are we going to use? Timing of relationship. Does it matter when we pose this intervention? And you'll see how this flows more as we talk more about the questions. And then what's the connection? Is there truly a functional connection? Is it just a correlation? We need to be careful about overgeneralizing our results. So as I said, the question defines the activities that we are going to do moving forward with our research. So we want to look at the question, then we want to consider what method we're using, how we're going to analyze that based on the method that we're using. Again, qualitative, quantitative. Interpretation of the results. We need to make sure we're not interpreting it in the way we want to interpret it, but really based on what the data is telling us, and then reporting those results out. In the chapter, there was 2 or 3 different scenarios where researchers did not report results accurately or reported results with bias. So it happens. I can even tell you that when I did my dissertation, the way that the data came out was not what I was expecting. I never had a moment when I didn't want to report that, but I did have that moment of, oh, wow, I was wrong. And you have to just work through that and realize that that's the learning part. That's what you want. You want to have that moment of, this didn't turn out the way that I thought it would. So what does that mean for me moving forward in my counseling interventions? So again, the dog wags the tail. We need to make sure that the question is guiding everything else that we do and not the other way around. So we have frameworks in order to do this. We're going to talk about two of those, and that gives us a way to get started and a way to move forward. And we really want this questioning process to just become part of, as I mentioned, your counseling decision making. It should always be present as you're working with clients. So we're going to talk about the PICO framework first, and this will be what you will use to write your questions. So PICO stands for participants, the sample or population, the intervention, what are we going to apply, the comparison, what will be used as a comparison. So if I'm applying the intervention here, what is the other group going to get? And the other group could get nothing, and that's okay. That's still a comparison, but we need to be able to compare our intervention group to something. And then what are we looking at as the outcome? In other words, what is our assessment to determine if the intervention is successful or not successful within our study? So here's an example. Our participants, let's say they're students in a master's research course. The intervention, we're going to use an intervention called hand hug stress reduction. So it's just a physical stress reduction activity. The comparison would be self-selected leisure. In other words, instead of doing the hand hug stress reduction activity, participants would do something of their choice, whether that's mindfulness or exercise or watching Netflix. And then what are we going to look at for our outcome? How are we going to assess that? Subjective stress ratings. So this does not always have to be, it can be subjective is what I want you to understand as far as your assessment goes. So be aware that that's a possibility as you're writing your PICO questions. So once we know what we want to look at, we can just fill out the template, which is what you're going to do in Blackboard. This is what it looks like. Are there differences in outcome? What's the outcome we're looking at among participants completing an intervention when compared to whatever the other end of that is? And then so here's how this question would look. Are there subjective stress ratings among master's students in a research course following a hand hug stress reduction activity when compared to self-selected leisure? That's a mouthful, but all you did was take those elements and plug them in to the PICO question format. There is another format that you can use as well. Vista looks at the data in a quantitative way, but a little bit differently. So Vista looks like this. You have your construct or variable of interest. What is it that you're going to be looking at? The sample population. Again, this we talked about this before, timing. So doesn't matter when the intervention is applied. If you're looking at a question that specifically relates to the timing of the intervention, then Vista is a nice way to write your research question. And then what is the nature of the relationship that we're looking at? Is it a correlation? Is it prediction? What is the nature of that relationship? So if we're going to write a question like this, we could look at it this way. Our variable of interest would be the number of research papers written and subjective stress ratings. So those are the two things that we're going to look at. Our sample is going to be master's students in a research course. The timing is at the beginning of the semester. Now, could you change the timing? Yes, you definitely could. But we're going to talk about beginning of the semester, and the association we're looking at is a correlation. So here's our example of a question. To what degree do variables aim of association, what are we looking at? What's the association correlation among the sample? So here's how we would write that. To what degree does the number of research papers written predict subjective stress ratings among master's students completing a research course? There's our question. So once we've written our question, then we can move on to the analysis, the method that we're going to use, the analysis, the interpretation of those results, and then how are we going to report that. And here's some things to consider when we are looking at all of those. Inclusion and exclusion criteria. As we're writing our question, this may be the most important part of the Goldilocks problem. Who's in, who's out? What population specifically are we going to be looking at? How are we going to get that population? Do we have access to that population already? Measurement of those constructs. How, again, what's the assessment? How are we going to measure it? We need to make sure that whatever we are applying is applied specifically in the same way to each participant. So that goes back to looking at the way our design is set up. The integrity of the method that we're using, the data collection, again, it should be specific, and we need to be sure that we're collecting the data at the points that we have intended. Then we get to analysis and interpreting that and reporting those details once we've completed it. So obviously, we are not going to be able to try a PICO question. However, I do want to show you some PICO questions from your library presentation that you're going to have. Oh, sorry. Here we go. So here are some examples of PICO questions, and I'm just going to read a couple of those. Are there differences in mental health and fortitude for overseas missionaries that implement biweekly therapy sessions for their health regimen when compared to missionaries that do not? Again, this is an example of a question where your comparison is nothing. So we're either getting the intervention or we're not, and that's totally fine. I'm just going to go down here and read another one. When looking at children with ADHD behavioral issues in Texas, will providing medication and information modifications in earlier education help reduce behavioral problems with children who have ADHD to those who don't struggle with behavioral problems with ADHD to help provide better tools or outlets to prevent major behavioral issues? So this is an example of a question that we would need to go back and forth and tweak a bit more in looking at specifically how are we going to measure this? What intervention? We have an intervention, but we don't necessarily have a way to measure that intervention. So good start to a question, but we would want to flesh that out a bit more. I'm just going to read another one here. Are there differences in anxiety, depression, PTSD levels among adults with a history of child abuse following a CBT session when compared to no intervention? Okay, good PICO question. We might want to consider, we've got 3 different measurements here or variables here, dependent variables. So we may want to narrow that down. We may want to just look at anxiety, or we may want to just look at PTSD. Sometimes it's based on what we can find in the literature, and that's why I'm going to give you some extra time. Let me unshare my screen. All right. That's why I want to give you some extra time to be able to write your research question after we hear from Ms. Grotwald, so that you really feel comfortable with that before you're required to do that. But last thing I did want to show you, sorry, I keep flipping back and forth here. But last thing I wanted to show you is where that question is located. Let me go back and share. So within your Blackboard, you're going to go down to assignments and developing a research question. And I just want you to see that it's laid out in the format that you're going to present. So, based on your observations, experiences, and curiosities, what population of participants are you interested in learning more about? Be specific. So we write that down. Based on your observations, experiences, and curiosities, what intervention are you interested in learning more about? Be specific. Based on your observations, experience, and curiosities, what comparison are you interested in learning more about? Again, the comparison can be nothing at all. Oops. And then what is the outcome that you're interested in learning more about? In other words, how are we going to assess? And then based on all of those things, we're going to use that template that we just learned about, and we're going to write our research question. And that's it. Easy peasy. So I hope that this breaks it down for you to be able to help you to make this more manageable if it's something that you're kind of stressing over. But again, remember that as we are writing this question, the purpose right now is for us to get a start. And then if we need to tweak it, that's what we'll do. So remember that we will have our live class next week. Start thinking about your PICO questions, start thinking about your population and interventions of interest, particularly. Start thinking about those. If you have some ideas and you want to bounce those back and forth, we can do that through email. We can always meet by Zoom if you'd like to do that. But I feel like the framework that you have is going to give you all the structure that you need to be able to write a really good question. And the last thing I want to say is really truly consider something that you're interested in. As we mentioned, if you're interested in it, it's the research part is going to be a lot easier. Looking at your lit review is going to be a lot easier because you're actually looking at something that is relevant and meaningful to you. So consider all of those, and we will talk again soon.